This morning started this idea on three questions for those that are just joining us. And that is, do you believe that God exists? And then, why do you believe or not believe, depending on what your previous answer was? And then the third part is, can you explain to somebody else about your belief? And we live in a world today that you cannot just assume that somebody believes in God. Used to, when you look at much of the evangelistic material, it will start somewhere to the effect that God exists, but not much evidence to establish that. Now, to try and to prove that God exists from the Bible is that there is internal evidence within the Bible that supports this and helps us understand that the supreme being is the God of the Bible. But to just simply go there and to just say, well, it says right here that God exists, so he does, is not necessarily evidence. And because some people that don't grow up being taught to believe and to have faith in the Bible would simply say that, well, if I was to write a book and to profess this idea of a God, then I would write that too. And in fact, if you go forward thousands of years and all of a sudden somebody found a book that suddenly had a collection of Marvel comic books, there would be a book that would have within there the idea of different gods. And so how are they to know with that book that those gods, and I don't use that they're real gods, they're not, but how do they know that those gods are false? And if those gods are false, does that necessarily prove that there is no God? Well, of course not. That wouldn't be it. It would be the wrong source. And so what we want to do is to be able to look outside the Bible and to see and understand that there has to be a supreme being. And so I don't want to rehash all of this morning's sermon, but what we started with is that if we have something like this mirror, we know it did not come from nothing. You can sit there and notice the components made of, and you say, well, where did they get those components? And then you start thinking about, well, if they bought the plastic, then where did the plastic come from? And we follow that back all the way, and we understand that in our minds, even in our finite being, we understand that something does not come from nothing. We also examine the second law of thermodynamics. And within that, it's the idea that matter, energy, is in a constant state of degradation. And it's tearing down. And we have proof of that. And evidence of that, just when we look around the world to us today, in our bodies, in our homes, in society, it is degrading around us. When we see examples of that. But the eternal being is not. Then we have the law of cause and effect. And in the law of cause and effect, we examined the idea that for an effect, or for every material effect, there must be an adequate cause that existed prior to the effect. And so we used some examples that were there. I'll use another one tonight. Ray back there is holding little Charlie B. And if I told y'all this podium was made by little Charlie B back there, you would know that's absurd. That the effect does not have an adequate cause. And so when we start examining the idea of cause and effect, we understand that there has to be something supreme, some power, something in existence that is eternal in nature, that had enough power to produce this world. And so when we start really thinking about that, we'll talk about God, and people will ask us, say, well, how then, where does God exist? Remember, the laws of science are to this creation and does not include the spirit. And we understand that God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And so with that in mind, we realize that these laws of nature do not apply to God, and that it does take something that is not materialistic in order to create this. But what is it? Technically, at this point in time, we've yet to prove God. All we've proven is that there has to be a supreme being that is spiritual in nature, or is supernatural in nature, that is not material, that had enough power in order to create this world, is where we stand today. And this being cannot be controlled or limited by the laws that we know and observe in this world. Now, to the skeptic, they may say it was an alien power. To the Greeks, the Romans, they may say it was a multitude of gods, or to the Egyptians. And I know in our minds that we struggle if we've been raised in the body of Jesus Christ and we have been raised in a mindset that the true and living God exists and that Christianity is real, and it's hard for us to understand. Well, how can anybody believe in the idea of aliens? How can anybody believe in Greek gods? How can anybody believe in a sun god, a moon god? How could they in the Old Testament believe in a Baal? I believe it's very significant that all civilizations have come to the conclusion that this world cannot create itself. There must be a higher power. Unfortunately, many of those people have not come to the proper conclusions. This evening I want to pick up and I want to examine worldviews. I mentioned this morning this material can be found in the book Convicted, produced by Focus Press. Dr. Brad Harrib has produced this. And this is not the easiest subject matter for me to always preach about because it's not my specialty. But I'll try my best to produce this or to present to you this material in a way that's effective and that you can use it. Worldview is the overall perspective from which we view and interpret the world and events around us. And that's important. And we know about perspective. You ever think back to something that you saw when you were a child? And you thought what you saw as a child was really big. And then as an adult, you haven't seen that in a long time. And then you go and see it, and you're like, that's not nearly as big as I remember it to be. That's a difference in perspective. And so there's a lot of different ideas of perspective, but when we view this world and how things work within it, where it came from, there are many different worldviews, but we're going to examine 5 most common, and we'll try and go through these relatively quickly. There's naturalism. This is the belief that those that are atheistic, agnostic, or that hold to the idea that everything around us can be explained through processes of nature. Most who hold this view believe that the scientific method is the only correct way, effective way to evaluate the world around us. And so within that, they use that to try and find all answers. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that if you go out into this world, you will come to the conclusion that there is some type of supreme being. We had to come from somewhere. This idea of, but where did that come from? 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 It will always lead you to there had to be something that there was the originating source. Now what that is, we don't know. Well, we do know, but we haven't come to that conclusion in this lesson. But when we start thinking about this idea of, well, how are we going to figure that? If you believe in naturalism, that everything's going to be done by science, that which you can see, that you can touch, that you can feel, that you can taste, and you can put it to test, then there's something very important that we're leaving out, and that is that which is spiritual. Because science cannot take that into consideration. Hence the need why we need a revelation from God to help us to understand. And what we have when we have the Bible, and I'm jumping ahead a few lessons, but what we have in the Bible is a revelation from that spiritual being to explain to us as finite, physical, material beings to try and comprehend that which is spiritual. And we struggle with that. And so people say, I want to be able to take the laws of science, I want to prove it. Then there's the idea of pantheism. This is the idea of New Age, Taoism, Buddhism, and it's the belief that nature, the universe, and God are one and the same. Any concept of God is normally very abstract. Most of these belief systems view God not in a personal way, but rather as some vague cosmic force. And so you have this idea, and one of the ways that I think about this a lot is different forms of Native Americans when they talk about the idea of Mother Earth. And this idea that everything has come from Earth, everything has returned to Earth, and they have this view that within here is that the supreme thing is nature, the universe. It doesn't really deal adequately with the concept of where it all came from, other than it tries to attribute the divine beings to that. And if you notice within here, except for New Age, Buddhism, Taoism, Kabbalistic, Native Americans, it comes from backgrounds of people that don't have great importance upon science, but just the natural observations of nature. Now, I understand in science, naturalism, you think, well, what we see in nature, but that involves understanding a little bit more complex of the scientific method. Then you have theism. Now, if you wonder what worldview we have, if you answered that first question that you believe in God, this would be your view, that you have the idea of theism. And that's important that we understand that, because some people, if you just walk up and you say, well, do you believe in evolution? What you got to find out is what kind of evolution do you talk about, because there are different forms, one of which is theistic evolution, and we'll talk about that later point in time. But theism is a belief of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And it's the belief in and worship of a supreme deity. Monotheism, in particular, is the belief in one God. Commonly, this form of divinity is wondered as being omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, and simply put, most who hold this view believe that God exists and is able to interact with nature and the universe. Now, we use the words omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. Omni for all, omnipresent means he is everywhere. Omnipotent is that he's all-powerful. And omniscience means that he's all-knowing, which those attributes give him the ability to be that supreme force of which we've been speaking. And then you deal with polytheism. Now, polytheism, if you notice the theism part, and I said if you believe in one God, it's monotheism. Polytheism is the idea of multiple gods. Greek mythology, thousands of religions hold to this. The Egyptians, since we've been studying Exodus, I'll bring out the Egyptians believed in and had a polytheistic view. And it's firmly held by many Romans and Greeks. The philosophy identifies gods for many material objects, such as the sun. It has a god. The moon has a god. Water has a god. And so when you think about why do we need to know these worldviews? Now, I'm not saying don't go watch these movies. But we need to realize Greek mythology has been tapped in by Hollywood to be a source for entertainment. And you have many movies that go along based off of the idea that there are gods over these things. And so I was trying to think of one of the movies off the top of my head, but I was thinking about one in particular that we talked, and it was talking, and in this movie we were watching, I remember the name Jackson was a part of it, but the setting of the movie was, here are these gods that had children, and they would go to this camp, and this is where they were trained, and you know, this is targeted at our youth. Now, in and of themselves, if we view it as a fairy tale, it's no different than the Three Little Pigs. It's no different than Frozen or any Disney movie you may refer to, or because that's all it is. It's make-believe. But the danger of it is we need to make sure we're aware of this so that we can teach our children, our grandchildren, what the truth is and make sure they know that that's not real. And then the fifth that we'll talk about within here is postmodernism. Now, to me, this is one of the more dangerous ones today, and because it's comprised of believers and non-believers. It's the philosophical belief that truth cannot be known. The recent belief system urges a change in thinking, that the notion that the past beliefs, whether it's theistic, naturalistic, polytheism, monotheism, they're not correct, because we now have a more complex understanding, and this view holds that dogmatic lines cannot be drawn on things like morals and truth. So with postmodernism, it just tries to deny the idea of a supreme being in all. So when we think about these worldviews, how do you answer them? How do you show them? How do we deal with the idea that there is a God? 7 things, and I'll leave the lesson with you. And I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. But I think Brad's book does a great job on these 7 arguments. Now, understand something. And I tell the students this, all you need is one good argument. And if it works, and it's true, then that's all you need. But the thing is, not what reaches one person doesn't always reach the next person. And so I believe knowing these 7 arguments will be beneficial to us when we discuss these matters with other people. We have first is the idea that every creation must have a creator. This is actually referred to as the cosmological argument. I found it interesting that NASA astronomer John O'Keefe declared, "We are, by astronomical standards, a pampered, cosseted, cherished group of creatures. If the universe had not been made with the most exacting precision, we could never have come into existence. It is my view that these circumstances indicate the universe was created for man to live in." When you look at the creation, you know there's a creator. Even in cosmo, means the idea of order versus the idea of chaos. Well, this podium that we have up here is made of wood. And it's been around a long time. At one point, I see some glue that was used in there. But it's been here, and it's made. Now, when we look at this as a creation, and you look at the design of it, you understand that it implies there is a creator. When we look to the world and the complexities of it, and there's a lot of examples that you could use. I listened to somebody talk about the human eye one time that was amazing. I will not even try to present that material to you. Last year during our gospel meeting, we had Jason with us, and he presented about the bombardier beetle and the way it was designed. There are so many complexities within this creation, it demands the idea of a creator. This is what the psalmist declared in Psalm 19 and verse 1 when he says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork." I'm having difficulty finding it, but there is a sermon that I wrote some time back dealing with astrology. Or excuse me, not astrology, astronomy. There's a difference. Dealing with astronomy. And I want to find it because the material I had was sent to me from an individual that while not necessarily a member of the body of Christ, he believed in God. But his background was that he was an atheist. And he was an artist. And he was interested in science. And it was actually through the work that he did in science and astronomy that led him to believe that there has to be a God. He looked at the creation and understood there must be a creator. Every design must have a designer, goes on. I forgot about Psalm 50 verse 6. "The heavens shall declare his righteousness, for God is judge himself." So you go outside on a clear night. It gets hard to be able to do that nowadays. There's so much light and it's hard to see the stars. But find you a place you can go and look at the stars. Look at the order. When we think about that, even with the design is where we're going to head here, is that every design must have a designer. We need to understand that not only do we have these stars, but they are so consistent that for thousands of years now, we have had those, and hundreds of years, those that have sailed seas, that have been able to get navigation based upon what's up there. The order that the stars have are there that we can follow for direction. Now, I'm not into astronomy, but it was interesting to listen to this man that was, because you can tell, we all thought we were looking at a big old star. We didn't know it was a planet. And it was based upon what time of year it is, whether or not we can see that planet or not. And when we think about design and a designer, y'all, it is an amazing thing to pick up a farmer's almanac. To when there's people that have studied the design and have understood that there are certain times to plant. There are certain times to harvest. And this is exactly what was written in the book of Ecclesiastes when it talks about there are seasons, there are times. You realize on one day you can dig a hole, and when you fill it back in, you have too much dirt to go in that hole. But if you read your farmer's almanac and figure out these signs and the times, you can dig that hole, and you don't have enough dirt to fill that hole in. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? I'll give you another one that amazed me. And I know this one worked. Because we had these bushes that were outside the preacher's house in Ackerman, and I lopped them off. I cut them. And as soon as I cut them, here they come, and they're growing. I checked the farmer's almanac, and sure enough, I cut them at a time that is meant according to the moon phases and the stars and what they understand about these, at a time that encouraged growth. So you can get you a farmer's almanac. You can figure out if you don't want to have to trim your bushes so much, then all you got to do is figure out what day that God designed and set in order to discourage growth. There's tons of these things that we can see and understand. And how did that happen? If we can sit here and understand it's not by mere chance at this podium, that is not nearly as complex as what I just spoke about. Could not be here without a designer, without someone to put in order. Why do we think this world can be here without a designer? Romans chapter 1, verse 20. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. The third thing is that codes require someone to program the code. Technically, our computers and these smartphones, these apps, all of those are being powered by codes. And it's not by chance that you can play your Candy Crush, but somebody designed that code to be able to work. And so we understand that there's somebody that's there within that code. And so for people that understand computers, you can use this argument within there. Furthermore, in science, millions of dollars have been spent looking for some form of a code to come from outer space. Now the reason being is that if somewhere out there in outer space we can pick up some type of code, then that will be proof of life. Okay. Well, let's think about that for a minute. Because everybody in here has a code. And that's called DNA. So complex that to break down the strand of DNA and to understand its complexities took over 13 years of study. So we have a code within us, and if there is a code, then didn't somebody have to program that code to create? This is where I wanted to have my notes with me, but I can give it to you later as far as the exact person that said it. But one of the co-discoverers regarding the DNA code actually said that we must remind ourselves that this is not proof of a higher being. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit. Why do we have to remind ourselves? Because they understood that with a code there must be a programmer. 4, laws require a lawgiver. Think about this in the sense of the laws that we've talked about, laws of cause and effect. Law of gravity. I love that one to talk about because I understand the law of gravity. Sometimes better than other times. I understand it real well out there on the skating floor. I won't hardly roller skate or ice skate anymore. Law of gravity doesn't go in my favor. And the older I get, it seems like that gravity pulls harder. I know it doesn't, but it feels like it does. And the law of gravity is that there's this constant pull that enables us to know that right now, I don't even have to worry about all of a sudden y'all sitting there that y'all ain't strapped in your seats. Because you're not just suddenly going to float up there because we have a momentary loss of gravity. That's not going to happen. Now somebody says, but Guyton, that law of gravity is not true. I've seen these astronauts train. I've seen them train, and they, within our Earth's atmosphere, they go so high, they drop that plane so fast, and there is a point at which there is no gravity. Y'all, even within the laws of science, they have figured out how to replicate weightlessness within the law of gravity. James chapter 4, verse 12, there is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who art thou that judgest another? The 5th point that we can talk about goes back to what we said earlier, the law of cause and effect. For every house, Hebrews 3:4, is builded by some man, but he that built all things is God. If you're talking with somebody else trying to convince them there is a God, talk to them about the car that you're in. Talk to them about the house that you're in, the building, anything. Talk to them about that phone that you have or the watch that you're wearing. And start taking their arguments that they're giving you about that there can't be a God, I don't know that there is a God, and just sit there and say, well, is there a maker of this? If I sat there and asked you right now, and this isn't even complex, but if I said, is there a maker of this? You would answer yes. I don't know anybody that answers no. And so then all of a sudden, have y'all seen that maker? Have you felt that maker? Have you tasted that maker? Have you heard that maker? So to come to the conclusion that therefore the maker must not exist doesn't work. We've got to make sure that we talk about cause and effect. We know this can't happen without someone with a being or some being powerful enough to create. Then you have the existence of morals. This goes to the anthropological argument. Psalms 90 verse 2 talks about before the mountains were brought forth, or ever thou hast formed the earth of the world, even from everlasting to everlasting thou art God. All civilizations that have been studied since the beginning of time that we've been able to study, there has always been a right and wrong. There's always a sense of murder. Now, if there's not a lawgiver, if there's not the idea of a supreme being, something in control, then what would make it wrong for me to murder you tonight? I'm not. But what would make it wrong? Who could say it's wrong? Who could set that in order? Only God can set these things that which are righteous. 1 Timothy 1:17, now unto the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, the only wise God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 3, and one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Now, these passages aren't proving that the God of the Bible is the supreme being. And these points don't prove that. That will come as we continue in our study. Not tonight. Don't worry about time. Revelation 4:8, the four beasts had each of them 6 wings about them. They were full of eyes within, and they rest not day and night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come. Where do we get that which is right and wrong? We get it from God, the one which is holy. Psalm 89, verse 14, justice and judgment are the habitation of thy throne. Mercy and truth shall go before thy face. Malachi 3, verse 6, for I am the Lord, I change not, therefore ye sons of Jacob are not consumed. And then the final thing is that communication requires a communicator. We understand that if there is communication, there has to be someone to originate it. If I walk into the house, or I'm sitting in here in this auditorium, and I start hearing a conversation, I start hearing a message, then I know there's a communicator within there. I might not know where it is. I might not see it. But that does prove that there is a source. We're going to take all these, hopefully next Sunday morning, and we're going to see and examine why the God of the Bible is the supreme being that is necessitated by this. Y'all, honestly to me, from my background, it's absurd to say there's not a God. It doesn't make sense. I have tried to comprehend that idea, and I think that's hard. To any of us in here that were brought up believing in God, it's hard to imagine the idea of these other gods. But we need to be respectful and understand there are people that are not being brought up the way we are. And that does not mean that there's not proof. God does not expect you to believe in Him without evidence. Think about what faith is, or from where faith comes. So then faith comes by hearing. Hearing by the Word of God. This is the communication that we have from Him to help us to understand that which we cannot see, taste, feel, that which we cannot audibly hear today. It is given so we can understand that which is spiritual. And there is a part of us which is spiritual. The spirit of man. The soul of man. And y'all, I can't comprehend it. I would love to tell you I got you all the answers. I don't. I can tell you a lot of the stuff I talked about tonight. Really, y'all need to pick up the book, Convicted. You need to read it because I didn't do it justice. I can point you there, but y'all, I can't even point you to somebody that fully understands the spiritual side of the soul of man and how it all works. That's why we get into these debates and arguments about what are we going to look like in heaven. That's why we have, and people write in, are dogs going to be in heaven? I remember seeing that in the newspaper as a child, somebody writing in wanting to know, and the answer was rather humorous and interesting, but you know, we don't get it, because what we're trying to do is to put everything upon a finite scale of materialism, in which God is a spirit and it is beyond us. His ways are higher than our ways. But that doesn't mean we don't need to take the evidence that He's given us and not convince other people of Him. You know, there are people that believe the Roman gods still exist. It's hard to believe that. Or that they ever existed. There are those that believe in Buddhism. There are those that believe in all sorts of things that are out there other than the true and living God. Even to the point that we have a very confused nation that does. I believe there are more agnostics than there are atheists in our country. An atheist will say there is no God, or say that he does not believe in God. Technically, you can't say there is no God, because if you say there is no God, then you actually affirm that there is, because you've already recognized the idea of a God. If something doesn't exist, then you can't even acknowledge it. Great debate on that with Kyle Butt and a man up in Florence that they had upon that. So you have the atheists that say, I believe there is no God, but then you have the agnostic that's pretty much just saying, I just don't know that there is a God. I don't believe in that. Y'all, we need to be going and equipping ourselves, and I need to improve myself on how do I deal with that agnostic. How do I teach them? How do I show them and convince them? And to say because I said so is not enough. We need to work on this because we live in a world and a civilization that is quickly forgetting who God is. And here's the problem. Have you noticed as we can deny God, go back to these points put before you, have you noticed what's happened to the morals and the morality? Because when there is no supreme being, see, those 5 worldviews, let's think about that for just a minute. You have the worldview that could go to humanist, in which we are the supreme being. Absurd. And so within there, so it's up to us to come up with what's right. Well, that could be challenging even just within this room to try and make those determinations. And so then you have the idea of, let's say, the Native Americans. And there's a lot of different beliefs within there, but many of them seeing the idea of Mother Earth. And so what makes something right or wrong? Much of it had to do with the earth. And they would attribute it to Mother Nature in the idea. The naturalist that observes everything by nature oftentimes will be the one that ends up seeing nature as supreme within there. And what we have got to do within there, then we decide, well, suddenly a tree, and the life of that tree is worth more than the life of a human being. I've seen people be that way. That trees or animals or something, then somehow that is on the level of a human being. I said the other day about some paper, I said, we're preserving that tree when we cut it down and we cut it up for paper, and it lives a lot longer than out there in the forest. But the creation is not that which is to be worshipped. But isn't this what Paul would say in the book of Romans? Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And then they begin to worship the creation more than the Creator. Where's this coming from? How are we going to fix society? I can bring up a subject of morals. We can go in there tonight, sit down at a table. I could just be the one to stir the pot, throw out a conversation, and I could get you started about the morals of society. And what are we going to do? We need to do something. It ain't what it used to be. It's not. And if we want to fix that, we've got to go back to that, yes, there is a supreme being. That supreme being is the God that we read of in the Bible. And we are His creation. And we must submit to Him. And when we start persuading people of that, the agnostic, the atheist, the polytheist, any of those other worldviews I talked about, when we do, then all of a sudden we're going to be effective in evangelism. Because y'all, if you go to agnostic and try and talk to them about baptism, you're wasting your time. You go to the agnostic, the polytheist, and you talk about the church, you're wasting your time because you're getting the cart before the horse. So please, while I didn't give you every answer, and I'm definitely not the expert upon these matters, I encourage you to study, to read. We have resources in the library that are available to you. We have websites that you can go to thinkfocuspress.org, and tons of articles. If you go to Apologetics Press, I think it's .org as well, but if you just Google Apologetics Press, they put out material after material after material that helps us to understand and to comprehend so that we can have the faith that we need to have in God and that we can go teach it to others. I leave with you the lesson and ask you, do you have faith in Jesus tonight, in God, that He is the Creator, that He created us, and He did so out of His love, And He wants us to be saved. He's revealed this to us through His Word. And you understand through His Word that you now have faith, that you want to serve Him, that you want to turn from your sins. Repentance. Confess Jesus as the Son of God and be baptized. If so, we're here to assist you in that. If you're an erring child of God, we encourage you to come back. But do so as together we stand and sing.